I'm going to be talking about the role of emotional intelligence and eating disorders, and really focusing on sort of how the body can become a battleground for those emotions in the way that Amy was describing this morning, and to give a bit of a feel about what that has been for people and break it down a little bit. So just a bit about me. So my background is, if anyone can guess, I'm from Northern Ireland. So I've worked in the third sector a lot of my life in Northern Ireland, working as young persons officer in Adapt Eating Distress Association, moved on to do some work for a larger charity called Eating Disorders Association Northern Ireland, and advising the Lawrence Trust, who were set up in Northern Ireland specifically for meals. And this was born out of a lot of kind of personal experience within school, where a lot of my friends had eating disorders. And as a little bit of a background, we have no inpatient beds for eating disorders in Northern Ireland. So a lot of people got shipped over to the Maudsley for treatment. And that was the background when I was growing up, was that's what I experienced and saw people experiencing. So I was pushed towards wanting to do something to make the lives of people in Northern Ireland a little bit better. But realised about halfway through my career doing that work, doing counselling and working with young people and their families, that we didn't really know why we were doing what we were doing, which made me feel really uncomfortable and pushed me into a research role, because I was going, well, I'm going into schools, talking about this, I'm delivering therapy for people, but I don't know why I'm doing it, and I'm not seeing a lot of change. And I suppose that was at the time when the NICE guidelines didn't really have a lot of treatments that worked for anorexia. So I embarked on my PhD in Ulster University, which looked at the role of emotional intelligence in eating disorders, and have since forward, I'm working for King's College, not in eating disorders, in more general inpatient work, and also doing some work with Nottingham University about the meal perspective. So that's something that I know that Danny and Dave will be talking about later, but something there's a lot of little bits of work doing. And at the same time, I also have a lot of friends who have eating disorders and have my own personal experiences, and also my partner has had anorexia as well. So I'm kind of steeped in a lot of different experiences of having been around eating disorders. And what really strikes me about the conversations around eating disorders is that there can be 101 different reasons of why people develop eating disorders. So when you work in kind of the psychology of it, there's the role of the anorexic gene, we're looking at the sociological perspective, we're looking at sort of more the cortical thickness of your brain and those sorts of things. And I feel really conflicted about that, because there's so much going on and there's so many reasons someone can develop an eating disorder. And in science, it's not as if it's maths, and I thought it's so conflicting, and often we work in silos and don't think about all those perspectives. And basically, it's really complex, and not one of those reasons for why someone develops an eating disorder is ever going to explain the full picture. It's a ball of mess. And how I wanted to do this presentation today was to say that I don't have the answer of which one of these strings is right, because I think they all have a piece to play within the role of the etiology of an eating disorder. But we can pick some of these strings to be able to go, okay, this is something that we can tangibly use. So as Amy was saying this morning, some of those skills that you can actually build, because if we go back to this, we can't fix the gene, we can't fix the broken brain sometimes. And that was what made me feel really uncomfortable when I was working in the area, is that there was no medication, there was no treatment, and the idea if someone is broken, that we can't fix them. So how I look at eating disorders and how they develop is through this kind of perspective. And I developed this as part of my PhD, and it was really to look at, it's complex. There's lots of pieces to play with someone who develops an eating disorder. And a lot of these issues can also be things that everybody in this room experiences. So these low self-esteem and the body image issues that we can be facing, so this mental health awareness week, focusing on body image, we all have those impacts. We all can feel that and dislike our bodies, but not all of us will go on to develop an eating disorder. And it's why is that? What part of that string connects that underlying issue to why someone may go on to develop an eating disorder? And that's what I've picked up today, is it's the emotional intelligence aspect. It's those ways that we deal with those discomfort, the emotions that come from, I feel really bad about my body today, and it's about how I manage that. So for some people, they're going to manage that and go, yeah, I feel bad, it's fine, and regulate that emotion. For others, they may engage in a disordered eating binge purge cycle. So that's what I'm going to focus on today. So I hope that gives a bit of perspective of what I'm looking at. So just to put in context what I mean when I say emotional intelligence, I guess it's an overarching theory to explain all of the different aspects that Amy was talking about this morning. So it's the ability to perceive emotions, to access and generate emotions, and assess thought, understanding your own emotions and other people's emotions, and to be able to regulate them to, it says intellectual growth, but really to be able to stimulate those social skills and engaging with other people. So it was developed, I think, anyone who's read Daniel Goleman's work, that's probably going to be the quintessential book from the 90s, and it's used a lot within leadership and within business models, but we're slowly starting to use it as part of understanding health and well-being. So there's a lot of research around emotional intelligence and individuals' ability to self-regulate and understand their emotions for well-being and life satisfaction. And actually smoking and drug use is probably where I first came across emotional intelligence. So people who have lower emotional intelligence are more likely to smoke. So that was the initial part when I was doing my psychology degree that I went, that's really interesting, that this is something from leadership can push on to be why people smoke. We don't really know. So if anyone wants to do that PhD, that's really interesting. And as I'm not going to spend too long on this, simply because we've heard a lot of the underlying things, but basically emotional dysfunction can be considered one of the main predisposing elements of anorexia. And for individuals who are living with anorexia, it can be a way of burying emotions and finding relief from anxiety, distress, and difficult emotions. And I think whenever I read these papers, when I was first delving into the idea of doing research, this was summing up everything people had said to me in support groups, everything I had felt, everything that my friends were experiencing. And I thought, this is it. But why are we not thinking about this more? And I was just shocked at how little we actually engaged with this conversation. So that's the drive behind what I'm thinking. And you can see that I've also cited Amy. So I had a fangirl moment this morning for anyone. Anyone who is a researcher will understand that. And a lot of the research around emotional intelligence, so we have found there's been a lot of research in the last kind of 10, 20 years around emotional intelligence, that individuals with eating disorders across the range, not simply anorexia, have significantly lower self-scores of emotional intelligence. And actually within a study that I completed, the individuals with eating disorder histories had significantly lower than the general population and than the population of prisoners, which was really interesting. That was one of the control groups to score against. And it was just the idea that this is a significant issue. And it links back to alexithymia that Amy mentioned this morning. This is where emotional intelligence came from. Sort of that idea, this theory that individuals who are unable to express emotions and name their emotions, and actually I think it's between 50 and 70% of individuals with anorexia may have high alexithymia, which is pretty significant. It was the most prevalence of any mental health problem in alexithymia. I may be wrong, I haven't read that in a very long time, but certainly a lot of the roots of the emotional intelligence literature comes from alexithymia literature. And these are considered still significant when we control for age, depression, anxiety, and gender, which I think is really interesting when we consider men don't have emotions, men aren't emotionally intelligent, all these constructs that we have. And actually, even when we control for gender, emotional intelligence is still a significant factor. I think that's really important for us to keep in mind for the conversations later on that people will be having. And I could just go a lot around the houses of some of the theories, but I'm going to focus on this one paper that's a study that focused mainly on the patient experience. So I don't want to go all statsy on everyone because that would be really boring, but there are other papers that if you're interested in this topic, I can sort of direct you to the statsy stuff. So this is also where the title came from, that a patient explained their eating disorder as the battleground. And interestingly, in the Hungry for Words work that we're doing, this idea of the body being armour and the eating disorder is your armour came up again. So this kind of analogy, so to speak, keeps coming up with people when we're talking about eating disorders and emotions. So if you're interested, please do cite me. So the most important aspect of emotional intelligence that came up with all interviews and within the statistical analysis of individuals and emotional intelligence was regulation and coping with emotions. And this was that individuals talked about how the eating disorder is a way to cope with what I'm going through. And even after 20 years, it's still something that I really struggle with. And a lot of people likened this to alcoholism or drug use, that it was the way to cope with things. And the problem with the eating disorder for this individual particularly, but certainly across the level, was that you can give up alcohol, you can give up drugs, you can't give up eating. So it was a daily struggle for a lot of people in recovery, because how can you recover and not be near the thing that causes you the issues? Oh, we're going the wrong way. And as was mentioned this morning, it's not always just a way to regulate the emotion, it's a way to avoid the emotion. So as this individual says, there's lots going on. And when I look at it, it's a way to dull that and numb it. And actually, whenever we pulled out more threads for this individual about what she meant by that, it wasn't simply about negative emotions. So we always focus a lot of these conversations around when something negative happens and you regulate that. But for this individual, she said, it's also whenever I was feeling high emotions and positive emotions, that was overwhelming. So physically within her body, within her emotional kind of psychology, it was all too much. And she used the eating disorder as a way to numb all emotions because they were all too much, which was really interesting because I've never heard anyone talking about positive emotions and how that can be a trigger. And I think that's one side that we don't look at within research, and I would certainly say if it's something people have also noticed, it may be something we research as well. And really at the core, the eating disorder has purpose and it's related to emotions. So everyone that I interviewed within this study said that their eating disorder was like a safe place, it was a comfort blanket, it had some purpose, and this was often to manage those emotions, intense, negative, positive, whatever. Everyone talked about this one theme. And actually, as professionals said, it's a wonderful thing and it actually works. And this is what leads us to a really difficult position, that if it's going to stop those emotions and it's going to help you cope with life, well, what happens when you come to ask for help? And I think this is the one thing that I hope you take away, is that recovery and change is really difficult for an individual. Whenever you take that crutch away, they can't continue to walk. If you're not able to manage your emotions and you take away that one coping strategy, what are we leaving people with? And that is something that I feel can be often missing within treatments. And I think a lot of the tips that Amy mentioned this morning are really important to engage individuals with. If we don't talk about the conversation of emotions, well, we're just taking the wheelchair out from under someone and not allowing them to then be able to walk and manage it. And this goes on further to the idea of emotional expression. So whenever I'm asked, what do I feel? What's going on? I struggle. And I struggle every day with this when people go, what are you feeling? And I remember the first day of my counselling masters that we were asked to go round and everyone say what you're feeling. And I kind of went, oh, I'm fine. And we were told, you're not allowed to say that. So my next emotion was, so what are you feeling? And I was like, I feel tired. And actually, I really struggled to have any way to express what I was actually feeling. It was often physical, sort of sensations and arousal, or it was these, the stiff upper lip of, yeah, it's all grand, it's grand, it's fine. We don't often engage with that, and we can, but at the same time, we've got a whole mix of things going on, and it can be so complex, but how do we actually express that? And as one individual, when she was talking about it, she was saying that she just felt invisible and a ghost and completely voiceless. And her eating disorder allowed then her to express that. And what we found was there was a big link with self-harm for individuals with eating disorders. I'm sure anyone working in the area has probably seen that too, because the eating disorder became a way to express those emotions because she couldn't say it. It was all stuck inside and she didn't know how to process it, she didn't know how to regulate it. And the only way to show the world what was hurting inside was to show it on the outside, whether that was scars on her skin or it was ribs, that she thought, I have to express this. And it's that idea of emotional language, that if we can't physically get it out, alexithymia, if you can't get it out, how are you supposed to engage and how are you supposed to get that emotion? And actually individuals talked about the fact that they were starving sometimes to make a connection, and literally starving. So this was a psychologist who talked that it was the manifestation for their emotion, and they couldn't connect with individuals because they couldn't speak and they couldn't say those emotions. You can't just spit it out. So they were actually starving for that connection. But without that ability to engage with it, it became really difficult. So the impact of those emotional deficits of expression mean that help seeking becomes really, really difficult. And treatment engagement, because, well, what treatments do we have? Talking therapy. I can't get it out. How am I supposed to engage with talking therapy? And actually, whenever we explored this theme more recently with individuals, some individuals with bulimia talked about how they were physically purging their emotions because they didn't know how else to get it out. And I think sometimes having that conversation and being able to engage with them and go, these might be the reasons people are challenging and why they're not engaging with therapy. And this connected more to this physical disconnection. So individuals may talk about that their body doesn't feel like their own, they become very disconnected from themselves. And a lot of individuals that have been involved talked about the difficulties of feeling lost and frustrated by their emotions and almost being absorbed by it. So they disconnect. And I think this is something that came out not only for anorexia, actually binge eating disorder, this was quite a significant aspect, that individuals felt even disconnected from their binges. So dissonance and those issues around when someone engaged with a binge, we actually had a number of people who zoned out when they binged. And I think that's something we also have to remember, because binge eating disorder does not get talked about. But the emotional effects, I could close my eyes and listen to all of the interviews that I've done as part of this study and the more recent one, and I wouldn't be able to tell you what eating disorder they had. The only thing was if they said what they had or if you saw someone, because actually it seems to be similar across the board. We just don't have the research in binge eating disorders. For one person, this is why I've brought up the binge eating disorder, she talked about that dissociation of the emotion and the body, and that actually she would be experiencing a lump in her throat, she'd be cold and clammy, and all these anxiety sort of emotional arousals that she was having, but she could not connect with her emotions in any shape or form. And she would physically push that emotion down and that lump in her throat down with food. So all of her binges were because she was having panic disorder and having panic attacks. But because that conversation around the emotions didn't happen within her treatment, she wasn't able to make that connection. And it's really important, again, then, that if that was the core of it, why are we not having that conversation? And again, just to sort of bring this home, that for males it can also come out in more extreme versions. So this young man, he didn't understand what he was feeling, and that's it. He was a ball of rage, anger and emotion, and he didn't know where to put it. And because males are more likely to be anger and lash out, he would get into fights, he would run off, it would be more extreme because of those social constructs. And actually that was why he tried to kill himself. And sort of one of my last points, and I suppose this is my big bugbear, is that it's hard to connect with others when you can't connect with yourself. And relationships can be really difficult, and as we know from this morning's talk, that's really hard. And it's one of the biggest barriers to help seeking, is that if I can't express myself and actually engage with therapeutic processes. But my biggest bugbear with eating disorders research is often ambivalence and non-engagement, and these damn patients who aren't engaging and don't want to change. And actually what we're seeing is that it's not necessarily that they don't want to engage, it's that they can't. And we don't seem to have alternatives for individuals who are struggling with their emotions, who aren't able to engage. And just because we talk doesn't mean we're communicating. And I thought that was the best way to describe that, is that it's not that they don't want to connect with you as a therapist, it's that they just don't know how to do it in the right way, so to speak. And that there is a drive to connect, and that it's not necessarily because they're sitting in that seat and not talking to you, but they come back every week. And that was the one thing that shocked a lot of individuals, is that, oh, well, this person is technically on paper not engaging. They're ambivalent to change. They don't want to, but they still keep coming back week after week after week. And it's that starving for a connection. It's that just because we aren't talking doesn't mean we're not communicating. Because as we heard from the talk earlier this morning, those people are communicating, they just aren't able to do it in the way that we think is right. If only it was as easy as just talk. And this is probably my biggest bugbear about a lot of our mental health awareness stuff, is that we say, just talk, as if it's an easy process. Oh, if I had just thought about that whenever I was 15 and severely underweight, if I'd only thought about going to the GP and just talking to him, well, it wasn't that. It was that I didn't know how to. I didn't know how to have that conversation. And also the fear that I'm going to be sent away or I'm going to be medicated, and even more emotional stunted. So that was a big fear for me, and I don't know about any other individuals, the idea of being put on antidepressants because I'll not feel anything. I was already struggling of how to feel, and of telling me just talk. I think we need to find that conversation from the patient's experience and be able to find how individuals, from all that science that we've heard, how do individuals need to engage with us for early intervention, because they can't just talk. And where individuals lack emotional intelligence skills, the physical representation becomes what they have on their body. So I have put too much on that, and I know that I've got sort of just 25 minutes going through, but those difficulties will have a real impact on the care plans and interventions that we create. And I think that we really need to change up how we're engaging with eating disorders and engage with this emotional conversation. And I think what I wanted to take away from this was, pardon me, was that it's not about us finding what caused that. It's not about finding the anorexic gene. It's not necessarily about doing that, because I suppose what that always felt like for me at the start of my career, and the reason that I wanted to go down this route of looking at emotions, was that I didn't like this idea that people were broken. That, oh, well, it's because you've got this gene and you can't be fixed. It's because you have the wrong chemistry in your body and in your brain. And I think by looking at it from the emotional side is that we can understand the experience, but we can also then understand that these are skills that you can build and you can grow, so you aren't broken. And I saw this and I thought, this sums up why we should look at emotions. The Japan objects aren't broken, they're repaired with gold, and that makes it unique. So I think that individuals with eating disorders, I don't want to look at it as they're broken people and that they have all this wrong chemistry. It's that the emotional side is just, it's a little bit tweaked and wrong, and actually we can fill that in and we can give them the skills to be able to engage and get better, rather than severe and enduring and all this sort of conversation. Let's change that conversation and let's make people not feel broken. So yeah, that was a really whistle-stop tour because I only had a few minutes. So I think we have like 5-10 minutes for questions. And breathe. Sorry if I talk too quickly.